The following podcast may not be for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Some stories are buried so deep, they seem bottomless. In this episode, we're diving into one of the Pacific Northwest's most bizarre mysteries. A tale that began with a late-night call to Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM in 1997. 9 miles west of Ellensburg, Washington, Mel Waters claimed he owned something impossible, a hole with no bottom. Not just a deep cavity in the earth, but a pitch-black, impossible void that swallowed 80,000 feet of fishing line without ever hitting solid ground. That's 15 miles straight down, deeper than the lowest point of the Pacific Ocean. But the depth wasn't just the beginning. Dead animals tossed into its abyss would allegedly re-emerge. Birds wouldn't fly over it. And then there were reports of strange sounds echoing from its depths in the night. The government said it didn't exist, and local officials claimed they had no record of Mel Waters. Yet the legend of Mel's Hole has haunted the imagination of paranormal investigators and locals for decades, inspiring everything from art exhibitions to conspiracy theories. In this episode, we peer over the edge of the mysterious pit, unravel Mel Waters' strange testimony, and ask the question that's haunted Central Washington for 25 years: what really lies at the bottom of Mel's Hole? Join me on this dark and bottomless journey. In the cold winter of 1997, a story emerged that would haunt the corners of our nightmares. On February 21st, a man named Mel Waters appeared on the Coast to Coast AM show, sharing a tale with the host, Art Bell, that defied reason. 9 miles west of Ellensburg, Washington, on Mel's land, gaped something that shouldn't exist. A throat in the earth that seemed to defy all logic. Waters claimed he had tried to find its bottom, dropping a weighted fishing line into the lightless maw. Down and down it went, past where any natural formation should end, past the depth of the deepest mines humanity has ever carved. 80,000 feet of line disappeared into that void. 15 miles of fishing line, eating into an appetite that knew no satisfaction. And still, the bottom mocked him with its absence. What lurked in those depths? What ancient darkness had Waters discovered, hiding in plain sight in the American Northwest? The answers, like his fishing line, vanished into the abyss. But the true horror of Waters' discovery wasn't in its depth. It was what the hole did to the natural order of things. He believed it had a paranormal ability. A local hunter, taunted by grief, had chosen the hole as his dead dog's final resting place. Hours after watching his beloved companion disappear into that endless dark, the hunter stumbled upon something impossible. His dog, alive, running through the dense Washington woods. But this wasn't the joyful reunion you'd expect. Once loyal and loving, the dog refused to acknowledge its master's calls. Something in those depths had changed it. With a stubborn determination, Mel Waters refused to let the mystery rest. Beyond measuring the hole's unfathomable depth, he needed to understand its nature. In a moment of inspired madness, he devised a test. He attached a roll of Lifesavers candy to his fishing line, an oddly innocent tool for probing such a sinister secret. Down it went, 1,500 feet into that hungry darkness, searching for any sign of water. But then he pulled it back up. The candy was bone dry. Whatever waited in those depths wasn't water. The hole seemed to defy not just physics, but everything we thought we knew about the world beneath our feet. A sinister phenomenon lurked on Mel's property, a void defying nature's laws. On Coast to Coast, he spoke of it in hushed tones, describing a dark beam of light he'd witnessed coming from its depths. But that wasn't even the strangest part. He held a radio near that hungry mouth in the earth, and the phantom broadcast would spill out of the radio. Ghostly voices, and music from times long past, as if the hole was bleeding memories. The hole's appetite wasn't limited to sound. Metal objects brought too close underwent horrifying transformations, warping into various alloys and substances that had no right to exist. In a strange twist to Mel's story, word of his mysterious hole reached a Native American community in Nevada. Their interest drew him across state lines in September 2001, where he found himself visiting people living in stark poverty, yet rich in botanical knowledge. They cultivated healing plants, passed down through generations, surviving on traditional medicine born from the desert soil. The villagers weren't after Mel's gardening expertise. They were fixated on his peculiar admission that plants thrived naturally well around his hole. After studying his descriptions of these vigorous growths, they exchanged knowing looks. Then they led him across their sun-baked land to something that made his breath catch. Another hole, a twin to his own, as if the earth had been punctured in exactly the same way in two different places. Deep in Nevada's unforgiving landscape lie a secret the Basque shepherds had guarded since the 1800s. Generation after generation of these hardy immigrants had grazed their sheep near this sacred wound in the earth. A hole that seemed to defy natural law, just like Mel's. But where Mel's hole gaped at 9 feet in diameter, this one was different. The ancient pit wore a collar of metal that descended into its depths, its surface oddly warm to the touch, as if remembering some long-forgotten heat. The Native Americans spoke of it in reverent whispers, describing its most unsettling trait, how it swallowed a sound whole. Drop a stone and you'd hear nothing. Shout into the depths and your voice would vanish. No echo, no impact, just silence. The Basque settlers had woven this anomaly into their spiritual fabric, treating it with the same quiet respect their descendants showed it now. It stood as a testament to something older than their arrival, perhaps then the land claims and property lines that carved up the Nevada desert. Like Mel's hole, it remained a mystery that refused to be solved. A dark mirror reflecting the unknown. Like its Washington twin, this Nevada hole cast its own sinister influence on the natural world. Animals would steer clear of it, their instincts screaming danger, their eyes avoiding the impossible black beam that sometimes pierced the sky like a reverse lighthouse. Driven by a curiosity and something darker, Mel and the villagers began probing the hole's mysteries. Their first test seemed simple enough. 2 identical buckets of store-bought ice, one kept at the surface, the other dangling 1,500 feet into the abyss. They waited, watching the surface ice melt under the Nevada sun, marking time until it was half gone. Then came the moment to retrieve their subterranean sample. What emerged from the depths defied every law of thermodynamics. The ice hadn't just refused to melt. It had transformed into something else entirely. Solid as stone, but inexplicably warm to the touch. It mocked their understanding of physics, but the real horror show began when they tried to melt it. The ice didn't surrender to the flames. It embraced them. Dancing with tiny tongues of fire, it burned like some unholy fusion of water and fuel. Perhaps more practical than prudent, one brave villager carted some of this ice to his cabin. There in his stove, the impossible ice flickered and burned through the night. A reminder that reality itself had begun to unravel somewhere beneath their feet. Their early ice experiments yielded inconsistent results, as if the hole itself was learning and adapting. Perhaps that's what pushed them toward more dangerous tests. When one villager volunteered to descend into the hole, cooler heads prevailed. They chose a sheep instead. The animal knew, even before they began lowering it. The sheep thrashed against its restraints with such violent terror that they were forced to sedate it. But consciousness returned as the crate descended, as if the hole itself was waking the creature. At 1,500 feet, the pit began to vibrate, sending tremors up the cable and into their bones. For 30 minutes, they left the sheep suspended in the darkness. When they hauled it back up, the sheep was no longer alive. Not a mark on its wool, no sign of trauma, just stillness. The butcher worked quickly, his skilled hands revealing the truth none of them were prepared for. The animal had been cooked from within, its tissues transformed by some impossible heat. But that wasn't the worst of it. Inside the carcass, they found something growing. Something alive. The mass pulsed with its own rhythm, and when they cut it open, human eyes stared back at them. A fetus, but not quite. Connected to life by an umbilical cord that seemed to mock natural law. The villagers reached for their knives, but Mel, perhaps touched by madness or divine inspiration, severed the cord and placed the creature gently on the ground. He explained that he felt it was a miracle. For 2 hours, they stood in a trance as the being studied them with an intelligence that felt ancient and vast. Its gaze held something beyond comprehension, not malice, but compassion, that felt somehow more terrifying. They watched, paralyzed, as it made its way to the hole's edge, under its own power. Without hesitation, it dove into the darkness that it had birthed it, returning to whatever realm lay below. They tossed the sheep's remains in the hole as an offering, like some primitive sacrifice, to the powers they couldn't begin to understand. As they stood there, the Nevada sun beating down on their backs, not one of them could shake the feeling that they hadn't been the ones experimenting. They had been the subjects all along. The creature's brief encounter with Mel marked only the beginning of the mysteries. Mel's current battle with esophageal cancer vanished after this encounter in the Nevada hole. He carried his miracle quietly, like the strange gift a Basque elder pressed into his palm before his departure. A 1943 Roosevelt dime in a red envelope. Its significance as cryptic as everything else about these impossible places. The hole wasn't finished with its revelations. The sacrificed sheep became a haunting regular, emerging from the depths, wandering, and again diving back into the darkness, as if traveling between worlds. The villagers learned to communicate with the ghostly sheep through radio recordings. its presence manifesting in pulsating tones that defied explanation. Meanwhile, the burning ice they'd discovered proved too powerful for mortal homes. One villager's stove, fed with the supernatural ice, crashed through his floorboards as if drawn back toward the underground realm that had transformed it. Mel Waters came to believe he understood what they encountered that day. The creature, he concluded, was no accident of physics or quantum anomaly, but something the Native Americans had known about all along. An ancient being that moved through the earth's layers like a fish through water, sliding between different versions of our world. The holes weren't just holes. They were doorways and had been there long before any of us. It was said that eventually U.S. federal agents came to view Mel's dark hole. They knew something wasn't right, and it was just something that needed to be buried. The government seized Mel's land and offered him a payout. You can hear Mel Waters on an old episode of Coast to Coast AM. Years later, a local news reporter investigated Mel Waters and could find no public records of anyone by that name, nor could they find any property owned by anybody by that name. Perhaps he went into hiding due to publicity? At one point, Jack Powell, a geologist with the State Department of Natural Resources, stated that the hole could not exist because it was geologically impossible. Were these holes really supernatural portals or all urban legends? I suppose we leave this to the unexplained realms. I wondered if Mel's hole had anything to do with the nearby Yakima military training base. Some say the military's involvement wasn't just about containing a geological anomaly. Some say they knew what dwelled in those endless depths and didn't want a paper trail. The mystery of Mel's hole remains an open wound in our understanding of what lies beneath our feet. While Mel Waters vanished from public view decades ago, his story of the bottomless shaft and its impossible properties echo through the corners of paranormal research. Though it's still undetermined whether Mel was even a real person. To this day, locals whisper about the strange sounds carried in the night. The coordinates remain classified, the land remains restricted, and somewhere, perhaps a hole, is still there, drinking in everything that falls into its eternal darkness, keeping secrets we were never meant to understand. And for now, I leave you as I head back into the unexplained realms. I hope you sleep well, knowing that sometimes the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as you think.